One of the reasons why I tried to write this kind of poem is essentially really to show that you can get the sense of the contemporary in Hong Kong. You can try and marry it with something quite classical, like kind of responses to Chinese poetry. And this is something that's quite new for me, so I wanted to give myself the challenge of doing this. What I've also been doing over the past decade or so, since I've been here, is I've kind of scribbled down a lot of fragments of what I've seen in Hong Kong. And I had this kind of crazy idea that I would try and put it all together in a single poem and kind of represent it as, you know, this macro history of Hong Kong. I'm not entirely sure where it's going to go, but I'm up to about 15,000 words. And what I've been doing, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, I think, is I've been adding a lot more urgency to the writing. Because I think one of the things about Hong Kong is the pace of the city, it moves so quickly that you write something and you find you have to update what it is that you want to say. And that's been one of the constant frustrations I've had over writing this single poem that gets longer and longer and becomes more and more, I think, urgent in terms of trying to represent the nostalgia that we can feel of this city because of the fact that things are changing so quickly. So I'll just give you a representative section of that based on the concept of history and the fact that when Hong Kong was passed from Britain to China, there is that sense of how we make a new beginning. So this part is called The Lost Records. I needed to know what made this place click, what made its frenzied hands labor all day, all night, as if afraid of some slow tick that would signal its countdown. Had it not, with all the changing times that it had seen, admired its past reflection in mirrors or stored its former self inside a flash, all those constant parades and passing scenes, rendered black and white, like an old newsreel cranked and turned by history's rapid hand. I stepped towards the great centers of learning, an eager savant for such a place and time, thinking the libraries would praise knowledge for the multitudes and seek diligence against the purging of all the great works, by hoarding them in vaults and annexes. I petitioned one surly librarian, whose face lent a blank repetitive stare and mirrored the database files found there on her computer screen. No results, nothing. Where were the swathes of broad parchment left intact from the heydays of empire? Were they not the people's inheritance, stamped and numbered against each salient act, part of this new century's renaissance? Were the archives all consigned to the stacks by clerks eager to skip a whole chapter of this island's pitiful history after a mere century's prominence? Are they not part of the missing story? The latest page-turners on the bookshelves beckoned with their glossy paperback slides to keep me corralled in their present aisles. Their bold scripts leapt at me off the covers with phrases on the new Hong Kong, China. Look at our newness, they all seem to say. What glory was there for us in those days? We have thrown off the yoke of oppression, rescued ourselves from the past, laid it low. We have updated all you need to know. So that's just the first part of a longer segment that I write, talking essentially about what we see as the official Western narrative of Hong Kong. So it's a kind of collision of different ways of looking at how Hong Kong has been constructed, recreated, consumed. And it's my attempt to try and see, as somebody living in Hong Kong of kind of mixed race heritage, how we try to reconcile these kinds of views. So it's very ambitious and it might fail miserably, but I'm just leaving it out there for you guys, just if it does ever see print. What I do then to finish is, if you don't mind, I'll reread a poem that I performed for another event, which I think Jenny and I, we were part of, something by the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. And I wanted to give this a second reading because it's grown on me, and I think it's very much something that is relevant to how a lot of people see, you know, the passing of the national security law and how that might impact upon them and their own mental well-being. So I'll just leave it with this poem, A Hong Kong State of Mind. It's the presumption of guilt that drives us back into ourselves, into our very core, that hushes us back, line by line, through every unlearned word or slogan. It's the gaze that follows us home, along corridors of regret, where every wall remains an unfinished canvas, or the stare that leaves each screen blank and each call or plea unanswered. It's the mask that stifles however it is worn and strangles every cry into a cry of despair. It's the touch that spells an act of longing. It's the longing that comes after a betrayal. But every act is still an act of living, a new beginning that grasps beyond itself. From each lonely child that rocks back and forth at night, cradling the promise of a word or declaration, to the artist forming murals in the sky of her head, or the worker already ticking off tomorrow's labor. It's to preserve in every utterance a sign that this day will be followed by another day, that the air is still free, and the morning that greets and beckons you into song is still yours, and no presumption of anything beyond this act of living can stifle your will to live, and no state of the mind will ever drown that voice that calls from within. Okay, thank you very much, guys. I can't hear the applause, but I can see.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
He is the author of 2 poetry collections, Accidental, Occidental, and Ancestral Worship. And he has represented Hong Kong in many literary events, from Colombia to Vietnam, Berlin to Egypt, and many others. So let's welcome Dave.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction, Jenny. Yes, I grew up in Hong Kong. I came here as a 4-year-old because my father got a job here, and we came out on the ocean liner. So that's still a very sharp memory in life. I want to start with the first poem from my collection called Ancestral Worship, and the poem is called Ancestral Worship. It's a poem about feeling really rooted to Hong Kong. I was very sick a number of years ago, and I ended up in a public hospital requiring a blood transfusion. And the orderly who came and delivered the food was complaining because I was in a public ward and I was the only foreigner there. And he said, "Oh, what are we going to feed this troublesome foreigner?" And 95% of blood donors in Hong Kong are Chinese, or perhaps 98. So after I'd been transfused, his name was Ah Kun. I said, "Wei, Ah Kun, 個醫生俾我中國血，我依家真係香港人，我依家食飯." So it's Ah Kun, the doctor gave me some Chinese blood. Now I'm really a Hong Kong guy. Give me rice. So this is a poem inspired by that, and it's called Ancestral Worship. I've got the blood of China in my veins, not through father, mother, or distant forebears, but passed on from another's ancient line. 7 pints passed through the eye of a needle, the anonymous gift of life for a bastard son, a white ghost. I feel different as I look at life through my wider, less jaundiced eyes. We Chinese treasure our traditions, but whose ancestors should I worship now? Mine or his? Maybe I'll just give thanks, pay homage to an eternal mother and the universal father. This next one's called Outward Bound. And lots of people think that in the colonies, it was all people from red brick universities who went there to administer the colonies. But in fact, most of the people who went out there were working class stiffs, like my family. And they went out there to better themselves and to work in the railways, shipbuilding, police, many of these sort of activities. So this is a poem about the journey out from Greenock, which is where I was born, a shipbuilding town in Scotland. Outward bound. Hannibal crossed the Alps for conquest and glory. We, adventurers of a different stripe, crossed the sea. Destination Hong Kong on the P&O liner SS Carthage, built by fellow Scots, launched on our own River Clyde. Up the gangway hand in hand we boarded, working class folk with bootstrap aspirations to cabins second class, the apartheid of imperial caste. No posh travel for us, but so-so, starboard out, staying out. Unlike that great general, never coming home to disappointment and betrayal. As we wave goodbye, streamers sever our links, leaving monochrome memories and the 1950s in our wake. Through Port Said, Suez, Aden and beyond, black and white Britain displaced, obscured, forgotten, by senses now shaken by shocking, pungent, grating colors, odors, and sounds. Familiarity growing as we travel ever eastward, warm and wet like a return to the womb. Perhaps I'll linger here a while. I used to live in a Hakka village, which is an ethnic minority in Hong Kong. It was a fishing village, and we get a lot of elderly people coming to visit. And this is what happens if you offer too much kindness to an elderly lady in distress in a Hakka village. Ambushed. An elderly man approached, asking about a toilet for his wife. Such a lovely old lady, how could I leave her in distress? Come, auntie, you're welcome to use my home. As I turned, 1 became 2, 2 became 5, and finally 9, all queued up and smiling, with me handing out soap and towels like a washroom attendant in a massage parlor. Then the questioning began. No one expects the Chinese Inquisition. Forget name, rank, and serial number. These are no mere amateurs. Cantonese aunties are better than the KGB at getting results. Name, age, place of birth. Do I own or rent? How much per month? Married? How many children? I could have stood a beating, but they were much too subtle for that, calling me by name and talking in turn. I managed to hang on to my 1 testicle and annual salary, but only because the bus was leaving. But they know where I live, and they'll be back. This next one is a bookend to the journey out, and it's the journey back. My parents both retired to Scotland, and I would go and visit quite frequently. Return of the Queen. The QE2 came home to the Clyde like a salmon returning to spawn. She birthed at Greenock's wharf to a festive expression of pride that Scotland's finest flowers in steam and ship and men had departed from these shores. Tied fast, she strained at the leash, standards festooned from stern to bow, from ship to shore and beyond, wind-blown like Tibetan prayers. I too returned this year, a prodigal pilgrimage. No one lined the quay for my arrival, but my shadow paced the well-worn path. I could have been a riveter, a welder, a shipbuilder, the Brahmins of the industrial age. I would have had a hand in the making, read the obituary at the end. But another destiny awaited me. We also departed, running, unclear if it was towards or from something, perhaps both, a Hajj and Hegira combined. Now, like the big ships, I'm all at sea in my native land, constantly drawn to that foreign field made home. I think I have time for one more, and this is from my original collection, Accidental Occidental. And this poem is about cultural and religious imperialism. Missionary position. I was met by two guys in the street with perfect bright white teeth. They wore bright white shirts and neckties in spite of the heat. Elder Smith and Elder Young declared the black plastic tags on their breasts. I was the elder of both added together, so young and so sure of their mission, traveling in pairs to ward off Satan and the temptation of a cup of tea. They asked if I'd heard the one true word. I've heard many a true word, some spoken in jest. They're collecting souls, so where do I sign? And when can I collect my wives and my new teeth? Their God was a white American in a white shirt. They were right and everybody else was wrong. At the end of their mission, they'll be taking their souls and going back home to help make America great again. Now that put the fear of God in me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dave. That's great. And when you get a chance, keep an eye on the chat comments. There's some really nice ones.
Lost that flag. So my dad used to work in a hotel. He's in charge of the food and beverage, and so it's often very difficult to find him. Like, you know, we can't really have weekend family outings because he's always working, and not Christmas as well. So, but then I feel like he's very characteristic of some Chinese fathers. Like, they're quite silent and they don't like to talk a lot, but actually inside them there are lots of emotions, lots of expectations for the kids. My father, who taught me how to fold serviette penguins. I was 8 or 9 when I saw you practice folding serviette penguins. For a long time, Christmas was a matter of watching fireworks on television, mother trying not to let her feelings show. And those evenings you came home, too tired to speak, your voice already spent with the customers. 13 hours of pacing around dining rooms, impeccable cutlery, well-ironed table linen, other families, happiness under the chandeliers. That's what work is, or has been, for you since you turned 18. And for all the fathers in the golden 80s, it's been a hard day's night. A husband must provide as long as he is alive. I try to think about who you really were. A schoolboy before duty, your father who never offered your mother a kind word, a kiss, but he kept a shiny statue of Mao long after the cult was over. You never finished high school because your father said he couldn't tolerate the idea of excessive schooling, a sign of moral corruption or citing. The day I was accepted for the school on One Jordan Road, where the school drive glittered with Mercedes, we knew we were moving beyond our league. And yet it suddenly seemed as if something was brightening again in you, something that has nothing to do with table napkins. Troops 2.0. 1. Incoming. I smell tear gas everywhere. 2. Imagine there are no countries. 3. Once upon a time, I lived in a place where the metro was never late. Everything ran like clockwork, and it was so safe you could walk to you could walk to Choi Hua for a bowl of wonton noodles at midnight. 4. There's no word in the dictionary for this. 5. Someone said to me, young people are all the same over the world. 6. He gave us eyes to see them and lips that we might tell. 7. Since June, my screen time has increased by 150%. I go to the news as soon as I wake up and right before going to sleep. Concern something might break out again when I'm out in the supermarket or picking up my daughter. 8. I think of my former boss, a very wise woman. If she were here, she would know what to do. 9. Karen's advice: stop torturing yourself. 10. Think of your parents. Think of how much you love them. Smell that fear. 11. Incoming. Let's not give up goodness. It is in real danger. 12. A mosaic of dreamers despite the rain, despite the heavy rain. 13. 人在做，天在看. 14. The world will never forget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. Really nice reading. And I think it's for you to introduce the last poet of this half.
Yes. Okay. So
to see 60 plus of you, on my screen on a Saturday night. I'm going to read 4 poems from my forthcoming book called Beseech Me. It's a collection of poems about my relationship with my parents, about my queerness or gayness, and also the complexity, the sophisticated relationship between, what does it mean by being a Hong Konger, right now at this moment. So I'll just read the 4 poems, in a row. So, because I'm not a big fan of explaining things between poems, I better catch the momentum. So the first poem is called On Insertion. I'm now fluid conscious, though still called riffraff by those who fuss about crisis between the legs. I put on my shoes to expose a spine of cursed commerce. I like the pain I caused to glossed leather when I tuck the shoelaces. Aren't our bodies a pair of rotating blades that carve the love out of us? Tell me how often I'm wanted like clean laundry. Nothing less than a multi-entered porn star, collared between enough and in addition to this love. Intergenerational. Obviously, it's a poem about my father. When you gave a few pushes on my mom to give me manhood and a prostate, you also gave me a natal chart and some bones to break in the years of fire. Maybe I feet had no good, brought bad luck. Still, I was given a surface to be licked by teenage tongues I then knew was called skin. A face I couldn't put away fast enough to avoid mistakes. Then you sold your yellow beetle, told me yellow is a homonym of your last name and mine. There's no gold. I forgot how you parented yourself. Should I decide it for you? At immigration, I clarified that people like us had last names first and first names last. I gathered bald socks from home for the hospital. I heard you say please in bed. You left your beans on the plate as if to contemplate the history of beans. I liked how you said "Lei Ye," your grandpa, not as a familiar reference, but to curse. No good my lungs, Lei Ye, you said. Then I remembered viruses in cartoons always looked irregular. Curses were an immodest form of childhood. Curse at your own risk. Then clear your phlegm, and clear your phlegm. You still didn't ask about the man I brought home, so I didn't tell you I was sisterly polyphagic. TV said K-pop was a happy virus, and males got pregnant in the seahorse world. So much phlegm thickens in your lungs. You took your pills and watched animal programs and learned that survival was hierarchical. Ugly fish were often accompanied by oriental music, while dolphins swam in an ocean of orchestra. Then you cleared your phlegm, cleared it, and it. You asked why I pulled out tissues from a paper box as if from the center of you. apologia of the besieged city. Some people love like they believe the romantic folklore about the moon, but they love too literally from inside a spacesuit. Or they love to feel like a shell put back onto the sand. They love the shoreline without loving to trudge back up to heartland. They love sleeping over in the dark. They love grazing my chest with defeat. Imagine the vibe in bed. Now imagine how hard it is for me to love them back. They are blind puppies when we fuck. They wriggle around to find an available nipple to nurse. They love dirty talk. They love asking for permission to lash out. They love doing it when I moan. They love to hear sure. They love me as much as they love the spasms inside electric Tanker cups. They love bathing me afterward. It's pretty, they know. Their terror lathering along my calves, so tangible and white. The last poem is called Golden. Golden is, how should I put it? Golden is a Hong Kong version of Reddit. So it's an online forum, mainly in Cantonese. I can't say Chinese, but it's Cantonese and Chinese because there's a lot of spoken slangs. And this poem is written with a lot of internet Cantonese slangs, written in section. Golden. 1. Despite what all linguists have said, you have to anger that the goodest English is the identity of our physical forms, or that it is a banal between lovers, but it is not that. 2. It is pretentious or fan gao to begin a poem with quotes from Mei Mei Bersenberg or Anne Carson. 3. Why? They are serious poets. Because 認真就輸了. 4. 回帶. The goodest English is delights on eagles. 5. Now that we have laid the foundation that poetry is about playfulness, let's move forward. Agar. 6. Since June, 2 hordes of beasts are in conflict with each other. One accuses the other. You have made a living seam. The other defends. That's a living sail. 7. 中出 is what seems to be a solution. A middle exit, a neutral exit, a potential of witness and intent. 8. A group of 左膠 knots. 9. Neutrality is not a compromise. The former is a disguise for one's missing bells of shame. Compromise is like remorse reflected in a shop's window, exposing yourself to an affair that way. 10. Aren't you worried? No. Aren't you worried about those guys? No. Aren't you worried that those guys came but had to sit alone? Yes. 11. Companionship is as comforting as applesauce. Fact-checked. 12. Though my arms, my butt, my guts are not jailable as those of it's not as jailable as those of the Bada on the front line. They take notice of me and my requests. 13. Teach me how to make love. Teach me how to sleep. The nights have stopped the wrangle of rationality. 14. To justify my hee-hee-ff, allow me to bring in Bruce Lee. 15. He once said, if nothing within you stays rigid, outward things will disclose themselves. And water can flow or it can crash. So, #be water, my friend. 16. One of the quotes is suspiciously homosocial, as in quote yi J, as in J yi cut, as in cut yi done, as in done yi done. 17. When the narrative ends, be the hacksaw or hacksaw ready. 18. Not all Not all water wants to drown. The plain one just wants to spill. 19. The city's walls and streets will soon grow immune to bullets invented and not. Pa 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 pa. 20. Take a volume.
I feel like it's always a privilege to be in the fine companies of poets. And I also want to thank all of us to join us for the love of poetry, solidarity, and Hong Kong. I'm going to read 3 poems. The first one is from my first book called Paper, Scissors, Stone. It's called BNO, which is the acronym of British National Bracket Overseas. A passport and a nationality invented by the British government back in 1984 when the John Doe Declaration was signed, and I think it was first issued in 1987. I always found that British national bracket overseas, that bracket has to be one of the most powerful and painful brackets in the history of punctuation. BNO. It was 1987 when my grandmother and I lined up in the stomach of a long queue right in front of the British consulate at the junction of Supreme Court Road and Justice Drive on the pre-Hanover Hong Kong Island. It was another subtropical summer day. The air tasted of storms and breathlessness. Long hours of cicadas buzz lengthened the equatorial idleness. Holding a dark umbrella against the hammering sun, my grandmother struggled to peel an orange. He fought with confidence that would ease the heat of my sweaty body. She subdivided it into little segments and gave them to me one by one as the line crept towards the teeth of a building as big as the battleship Potemkin. The sour, tear-like orange was there like a clove of garlic melting in my mouth. It wasn't a time for complaints, and nobody murmured a word of discomfort. It was the silence of refugees longing for an identity foreign to this tiny, floating, motherless city. Years after my grandmother died of old age and solitude, I am now waiting again at the head of a long queue in front of the immigration desks at Heathrow Airport. There is no sun, no umbrella, no cicada, just me and my passport. To the impassive official, I hold out this bruised, red, traveling document, product of one country, 2 systems. I am again abandoned by 2 countries between 2 continents. I walk towards the desk with rehearsed apathy. There is a familiar taste of orange sourness running on the tongue, swallowed by the stomach. So that was 1987. And 2 years later, in 1989, on June the 4th, something terrible took place in Beijing. We have to remember that was only 2 years after the first BNO was issued. I'm going to read from a poem in my second collection called As Low as Possible. It's called Among School Teachers. In 1989, I was 10 years old. I was studying in primary school, quite a humble local primary school. When the terrible incident took place in Beijing in June, it was the high exam season. And we all of us in Hong Kong know that very little can actually stop the exam season in Hong Kong, perhaps except for coronavirus. But that year, the exam didn't stop. We took the exam And in July, all the students were called in. We didn't know why we were called in. We were all called in for one day only before the summer holiday. And that day, all we did was to sing and sing with all the school teachers. Among school teachers, the gate closed, bell unanswered, basketball court stripped bare to lions and sparrows. July was never the month for learning. A school on clear Water Bay Road, yet no water, bay nor road. Through the lotus-flowered magnolias, a bridge I used to cross to the clamour of books. A month of no children, but the translucent playground after rain recalls the aftermath of hide and seek. What's the time, Mr. Wolf? The tick-tocking knees, the run for life. A boy under a tree restless for the world to spin in 10 seconds. That summer day, among school teachers, we stood and sang. Not of psalms and gospels, but farewells and falling men. How bodies became mountains. How the wind knew of sadness, the soil of love. The color of blood was the color of our flag. In the assembly hall, children who knew little of death had seen images of guns and wounds, a speck of a person stopping a column of tanks. It was a clear day, but we were all shut in. The ground deserted to the democracy of the sun. The cicadas buzzing their way to the dead of summer. The world waiting under some tree. 1,000 souls still singing in the dark assembly hall on clear Water Bay Road. I'm going to end with a new poem that has been published by in the most latest issue of Poetry Island Review. It's called Suddenly, and it has an epigraph by the American novelist Elmore Leonard. Quote, "Never use suddenly, the most overused, least needed word in fiction." Suddenly. Suddenly, the clouds not unraveled, and a droplet fell from a womb. 3 days of hard labor had broken her. She said she was too tired to name the boy. Suddenly, the blackened milk teeth gave up after a year of antibiotics. The doctors baffled. His locked mouth was fed sheep's solidified saliva to clear his feverish chest. Home left him suddenly. At a zebra crossing, his father suddenly took his hand. No cars, no danger ahead. But being held was a strange thing. Moving in with his family, stranger. Suddenly, he stopped speaking first week at school. Teacher called his mother in. When asked to explain the silence, he said he had nothing to say. Suddenly, at 14 on a bridge, he vowed never to reproduce. Desire suddenly overtook fear. After watching Kieslowski's Decalogue in one sitting, he spelled out his heart and asked what togetherness meant. Joe walked off in the rain. Years later, suddenly, he discovered from the book of not watching Decalogue, not asking the right question, not spelling things out, no Joe and no rain. Suddenly, a handful of milk seeds, and suddenly, man. Suddenly, 2001, two professors persuaded him to study a malleable thing called literature. Hong Kong had returned to China, but he flew to Britain. Suddenly, people spoke Yorkshire, love on the bus, love in the shops. Yorkshire stared at him, and he stared back, like two neurons in a busy translation loop. Suddenly, one autumn, he found love and blockades. A logjam and suddenly diversions. Everywhere, the road signs read divorce, teenagers, anorexia. He claimed driving was in his DNA because his father was a taxi driver. Suddenly, his tongue tripped on the English alphabet. When he rebuilt Telford Gardens Library he was brought up in, but now demolished. People call that poetry. Suddenly, a voice, a temporary abode. Suddenly, he failed and blamed the words and the ship's saliva. How many edible birds' nests were robbed in exchange for lottery of half-tuned stolen keys? And what could he say to the superior blast that suddenly erased his vocal cords, retinas, eardrums, taste buds, and all the tendons on his fingertips? Heart. Suddenly, rain churns up the clouds and stops.
Quite sort of somber, but also glad that we were able to share this space together today. And thank you for inviting me, Jenny and Gale, for organizing this event as well. I mean, returning to what I was saying a little while ago about feeling like I've been away for so long, I think it probably will take me maybe a few years' time to really write about this moment. But what I have been able to write about, I realize, is the experience of living through SARS when I was a teenager. I was 13 when it hit Hong Kong, and perhaps now living through COVID in the UK, it's just brought back a lot of memories about that period. So I have two new poems that I'll be reading about that experience later on. But I'll start with one poem from Flesh. And Flesh was written, past 5-6 years. And a lot of that was about sort of coming of age, about queerness, about feeling when I was younger that I didn't have a space in Hong Kong or in the community that I was in, that I didn't feel safe. I felt like I had to leave in order to find who I was. And, looking back, I wish I'd known the work of Nick, or had I had someone like that, growing up, I would have felt that there was a place in Hong Kong literature for a queer person or poet. So this first poem is about that period, and it's called A Wild Patience Has Taken Me This Far. I am writing in the voice of my most hopeful self. Amnesia was my daily bread. Thank God for fan fiction, for it gets better, for poets audacious enough to mention the body. Do you know what camouflage looks like on a day-to-day basis? Checking the coast is clear before opening a single tab and multiple decoys on a screen. Surreptitiously reading Shakespeare, the scene where Cesario woos Olivia. Watching my parents' faces for a sign to hold a tidal wave back. A daily prayer for the strength to confess nothing at all times. One day, it becomes a choice to walk out of this life or to begin living mine. I left half of my language behind to escape my impeccable persona. How I wanted to perform a heroic act to gain acceptance into the kingdom of ordinary people. To love a city and to not have it love you back is its own form of torture. When I met a beautiful stranger for the first time, I was deeply afraid of her tenderness. An appointment with a therapist led to a second date. I was given permission, needed permission. She held my hand till I began to comprehend the territory of skin, its frantic heart and silent ponds. Most nights, I dream of my mother's face, by turns harsh and tender. In a nightmare, I shouted at her, "Neither you nor I are the enemy." What do mothers ask their own daughters everywhere in the world? Is there a question? Ask me something. So this next poem I'll read is a slightly newer one. I began this around January this year. It was in response to a commission. And the commission was simply on the theme of something called altered nature. And we could interpret it however we wished. And this poem is the product of that. Altered nature. The birds had their tongues tied to silver strings as they hung mid-air in silence. I was kneeling on the wet earth, crying out. A disembodied voice informed me that nectar was being slowly harvested from their throats, that this was the only way. Heat from their flailing bodies pressed my eyes into my skull. I tried to hold myself together in the dream, but could not. Once awake, I could not feel tender. The brutality of all architecture stunned me wherever I looked. What were we, as a species, doing? I finally summoned the will to write life on my to-do list, but kept postponing the task. I had been dreaming of the dying, because I could not ignore the news from home, country not so far from the heart. This viral uncertainty keeping me afraid of intimacy. I did not want to touch what others had touched, feared any public surface. Even the air was menacing, invisible droplets omnipresent. A persistent cough soon developed, as if to taunt me. My father, a rheumatologist, texts to say he is well, reminds me that he went through the SARS epidemic and never took a day off work. I have inherited this stubborn Calvinist ethic. Today, I return to where breath feels possible. My therapist asks, "What do you want?" I think to myself, mother's gaze, straight gaze, male gaze, white gaze. I am ashamed to confess that I want to be reborn as the brother, the beloved son, the future patriarch. I want to see this torso in a different light, beam on it a kinder gaze as I wait for something to give. I read a poet's words. Mostly, we do not fail to go on living. There is fire on the streets of a city I still love, and fire in the earth's lungs as the hour ticks on. Had I simply imagined this intimate scene, the mother lying prostrate at the feet of her child, begging for a miracle, or was it the other way around? And then I'll end with this poem, and it's interesting what Kit was saying. I do think there is a lot of fear right now around the world for many different reasons, and this next poem is called Bright Fear. Bright Fear. 1. During these lengthening days of sunlight and bright fear, there is too much language and too little time. I am afraid. I am left to search for desire indoors, my hands steeped always too long in soap, then the wetness and the drying, to allow once more for soiling, another faint gesture at the enmeshed world, to keep it at bay while keeping it in mind, so I never lose sight of its riven beauty. Today I saw trees and witnessed bodies moving beneath their shade. 2. Before the streets emptied, I would long to dwell in quiet spaces, dreaded long trips underground. Too much of everything kept me on beta blockers as a child. Today I seek solace in walls and try not to allow the headlines to dictate my days. Bright fear comes to those blessed to live in a country goaded by nostalgia. I display my staff badge like a shield. Lecturer might ward off a fist in dusk or daylight. I walk into classrooms feeling the inward twist of what has come before. Histories, memories, facts. 3. To consider grief a resting place is to understand how it can suddenly surge through the body like a bout of bright fear, how it can seat us firmly on the sofa and leave us there for hours, till our lovers rouse us to eat, to partake in the daily rituals of an ordinary life. All grief at its heart is ordinary. Today, I cried again over a bowl of porridge. There is always either too much or too little of it, the salt on my mother's lips, our inability to trust the song of our bodies, the way a tear comes on, like a poem. Thank you.
Maybe we should unmute and applause people right at the end. Jason's son is back from the cinema, I think, so that's our signal to finish the evening. Hi there. We met about a year ago. And unless there's anything you want to say, Jenny, at this point? No, you're muted. You muted yourself.
Sorry, I just wanted to, that was beautiful reading from Jean, and also just to really remind everyone to try to buy their books if you haven't yet. I'm sure that you have, yeah, and also the donations to the readers would be quite good to show appreciation to the poets.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for putting this together, kind of curating it. Real rich mix of voices, and very nice to hear both the variation and the bits in similar. As Jenny said, if you're able to make a donation, it's on the chat page. But more as important, just keep in touch. We usually do a regular reading every month at the Poetry Cafe, but now they're irregular, so we'll let you know when the next one is. But thank you very much for coming. But the most important thing is to thank the poets, Jason, Dave, Jenny, Nick, Kit and Mary Jean. And do feel free to, everybody can unmute if you like and applaud, and feel free to hang around, but thanks.